We are so thrilled to have Punya Upadhyaya today, speaking about the genius of Gandhi, celebrating Gandhi's birthday, October 2nd. And I have to read your intro, even though it's an older one, because it's the best written intro of anyone we've ever had, I think. Punya is a global expert in organizational leadership and culture. I still don't know what you actually do, but this is really great. Having worked with the top 10 companies of the Fortune 500, Native American nations, South African chicken farmers, and other fun people, he's lived in Taos since 1995 with the love of his life, Pam, who sits beside him here, and with the land and with his guru. The big deal for him has been continuing to learn how an MBA helps an ashram and vice versa, how a Sundance informs a PhD, and how social movements in South Africa and India inspire boardrooms in New York City and London. That's intriguing to me. The weave is vivid, the loom is resonant, and we are the needle. That is very well written, Punya. So talk to us about Gandhi. We're so pleased you're here.
Namaste, everyone. Good morning.
Namaste.
Thank you again for the invitation. I love this opportunity to spend time with you and to reflect on things that matter. Many of you I meet at the ashram, but I'm mostly running around there. So it's nice to have a space where you can also sit and think and talk together. So thank you for this invitation and this opportunity. I really appreciate it. So when Jenny asked me if I would talk on this day, I was like, oh, cool, it's Mahatma Gandhi's birthday. We should talk about him and the fact that, he's amazing. And as we think about him, before we go into talking a little bit about him, I just want to also talk about Jane. I had a friend of ours who spent a lot of time with her, with Jane Goodall, and she's a musician. She did music for several of her documentaries and so on. But one of the things she said about her that I loved, she was posting, memories, is that she was very mischievous, And some of you have heard about that cartoon from, I think it was Gary Larson. There's these two apes out there, and one of them's holding up a long strand of hair and says, "Blonde hair, have you been out for Jane that tramp again?" And our organization wanted to send out cease and desist notices and so on, and Jane, on the other hand, laughed and made it into a print and used it to raise money and celebrate. I thought it was, but that's one thing that I liked about her that I think about when I think about spiritual teachers and so on, and people who are doing the work, like Mahatma Gandhi, is that they're often very mischievous. And we have this tendency to think of spirituality and the sacred and all of these things as things that isolate us, things that we do on our own, things that we meditate on, things that we, make us serious, and wisdom is often seen as heavy. And what we learn from the teachers who inspire us, who live with us, like Baba at the ashram, like Amma, who has many of people in the room, or like our Native American ceremonies, like so many of the other things that do us, like this gathering, we play and we share and we sing, is that the spirit, the sacred, is truly joyous and fun and has a blast, And yeah, sure, parts of life suck, right? Whether it's personal, whether it's national, whether it's global. We can feel terrible about the ICE raids in Chicago, and you have 3-year-old kids being zip-tied for between 1 and 3 in the morning. I mean, that is disgraceful. Who are we as a society that we elected this? Right? We, of course, talk about Gaza, starving children, Ukraine, children being bombed, the Congo, Sudan. I mean, we can go on. The list Just because we aren't talking that much about it doesn't mean that Tibet or the Uyghurs are in much better shape. Right? The ongoing oppression of the indigenous peoples, it's like, the list is unending. Right? And that is part of being human, that the list of the things that go wrong, the evil that we do, the bad things that we do is unending. And yet the sense of spirit keeps coming back. And that was Mahatma Gandhi's genius, that not only did the sense of spirit come back, but he was very clear that his personal cultivation of his self was the way in which he would serve and generate liberation for all things. And I think that is critical, that we don't do our spiritual work as a quote-unquote selfish act. It is self-centered in many ways because you have to be centered in yourself. The space where you invited the light within us, that is important. But it's really important to be able to say, I do this so that we serve. Now, again, it's one of my favorite phrases, and I remember hearing it. I had to hear it a few times before I got it. But when we used to be at the Lakota Sundance, the chiefs would say, we do this that the people may live. Right? It's an incredibly difficult ceremony. It's incredibly painful. It's incredibly beautiful. It's incredibly energizing. It's so damn tiring. It's so many things. But the reason we're doing this is so that the people may live. We do these practices so that we may live. We do these practices so that all life, not just humans, but animals, trees, microbes, the stars, all of them get life from the work we do, from the spiritual work we do. And I want to share a quote from the Mahatma, where he's back in India. So do you guys know his basic biography? I should take a moment and just give you a basic sense of what he did.
Yes.
Let's take a moment on that. So he was born in India, in Gujarat, and he was the upper middle class, if you will, right? He wasn't poor. His dad was a minister in one of those small kingdoms. So India used to have hundreds of these small kingdoms. That was one of the big deals when we got independence. We actually spent time nailing down somewhere between 500 and 700 small kingdoms and making them part of India. So that you'd have this pockmarked little map, right? And the Mahatma was born there. As a kid, he ran around, but very early on, he had an experience where he lied to his father. And his father was disappointed in him. And with that disappointment, it struck him very deeply. He was a very sensitive person, a very sensitive child. And he said, I'm going to speak the truth from now on. And that was, at a very young age, he said, I'm going to focus on truth. And that, if you will, is, the word for truth is sat, satya. And sat has multiple meanings. One of the basic meanings is existence, right? And so what he would say is that people would say to me that God is truth. God takes the form of truth. And he'd say, for me, truth is God. And so he would be very honest, very truthful. Thank God he had a sense of humor, otherwise he'd have been insufferable. So unlike many, he did not weaponize truth, right? He used truth, but he used it in service. So, then of course he had all the normal running around and being bad that, middle class kids in India get into, which is really nothing like what kids out here get into. So it's sort of like amusing to see them talk about, oh my God, he was so bad. But at a very young age, he got married. And one of the things that is true about him is that he was horny. And that was a big deal for him. And it actually was a struggle for him much of his life. Unfortunately, in one of those moments that, if Sigmund Freud had paid attention, he would have had such a blast. He had the sad thing that he and his wife were making love, and his father was dying. And they knew his father was ill, but his father died while they were in the middle of making love. And in the middle of that, they get this. And that rippled through his life. Now in India, of course, in the ascetic traditions, in the normal traditions, especially in those days, even today though, but even those days, we were very clear that abstinence, that the cultivation of your, Chinese medicine call it qi, in India we call it prana, the retention of semen for men is very important. And so there's this huge dialogue, if you will. Diane, come up, there's a secret here. There's this huge emphasis on that. And so now he's going against it. And the poor man spent the next 70 years of his life struggling with this. His wife actually got very irritated at him at some point. She was less irritated about having to go to jail repeatedly with the British than with his constant, oh no, I can't do this anymore. We have to be abstinent then. You know? So she was like, oh God, make up your damn mind, would you? So, but like most men, we don't do a good job of that. So he struggled with that all his life. So he was very human, and that's part of where he came to towards the end of his life. One of the things that people often complained about was that he had these young women who would sleep naked with him. And that was part of this lifelong push to say, how do I deal with this desire? How do I deal with this tremendous force that just impels me, that shames me, angers me, but draws me? And that was one of the spiritual programs that he ran throughout his life. I did read essays by one of the young women who was part of that thing. Name was Manu. Manu and Abha were the two. They were his grandnieces or something. And she talks about him with such incredible love, right? And the way in which he and his wife were literally her parents. I mean, she actually, as a child of 13, decided that she was going to go to jail with them because she didn't want to be apart from them. So she promptly, joined a protest or a demonstration and got locked up in that and then pulled back into jail. And both her grandparents were very unhappy with her for doing that because obviously you don't want your kids in jail, but hey, such is life. So as a young man, he was, he was okay. And then he was middle class, upper middle class. He went to England to study. He became a lawyer, came back to India, failed in his law practice, really struggled in work, got invited to South Africa to help do some work there, went to South Africa and did quite well. People actually liked him. One of the interesting things I learned about his time in South Africa was that because his clients, who were Indians, there's a huge Indian diaspora in South Africa, were well off, that he as a lawyer was constantly hounded by Christian friends of his Indian friends. They really wanted to convert him. And it was very funny. It's like there's a whole debate he has with some of them about his malas, is to wear these bead necklaces. And they'd say, well, if you're so spiritual, why are you wearing one of these? And he was like, my mother gave it to me. And it was like, well, you should take it off because it's obviously dragging you away from the truth. And he said, well, I don't know about that, but I do know my mother gave it to me. It means a lot to me. When it breaks, I may not ever replace it. But I'm not going to let go of this because of your ideas of what truth or love mean. Everybody has their own individual journey of discovering God. That's one thing that the Mahatma, very much in line with the broader Indian traditions, right? If there's 7 billion of us on the planet, there are 7 billion pathways to the divine. Right? Nobody's pathway works for everybody else. And so he was there, and while he was there, he started discovering racism, right? Which, of course, growing up in India under British rule, he was obviously experiencing some of that, but was also fairly isolated. He was in a kingdom in a small place. He was a big fish, small pond. It was okay. South Africa, suddenly he was small fish in a big pond and realized the indignities being heaped on him. One of the things to remember is that he's very clear and very honest about the fact that he's not someone who's born perfect, right? And so one of the things that you notice when you read his stuff from South Africa, especially the beginning parts, but even some of the ending parts, is that he was incredibly racist about black people, right? And so you have this thing which is, by the way, still true in India now, so it's not something that we've changed much. But he started out being very racist about black people. And part of his horror and anger was that how can the British, who should be smart, treat us Indians like those black people? What's wrong with them? We're obviously better than them, right? And that splitting is part of how colonial powers always work. Right? And he was very much a victim of that. Anyway, they had a war, the First World War. He was an ambulance operator and he volunteered there. But as he spent time with that, and as he spent time with the racism of the British, that's where he started developing some of these tools of nonviolent resistance. Because he was very clear that as a moral principle, he did not want violence. As a moral principle, he didn't believe in attacking someone. So they did the fasting, they did the boycotts, they did all these different things with the idea that, and they found that to be very effective. The British were kind of stymied. They had not experienced that before at scale. And that, of course, as many of you know, those techniques were developed further in India and were very critical to the, for example, the civil rights movement in the US. So Martin Luther King Jr. would talk about how they learned so much from Gandhi and that he was the direct not just the inspiration, but actually the design of many of their nonviolent protests were done because of Gandhians who worked with them. Right? So, but he goes back to India, and now he's a small celebrity. He's because of his successes in there. And in India, he starts walking around and realizes that he does not know what's going on. And he basically decides that he spends time with poor people, and there's something in his heart that gets moved. So now he has the opportunity actually to be very successful, right? There's all these people who are activists, who are willing to support activists. There's a bunch of rich people who are supporting all the folks who are working on freedom struggle and so on. And most of these people are matching the British, matching the elites. So they wear their three-piece suits, they have law degrees, they have, PhDs, they have gone and studied primarily in Europe, but a few had come to the US because it was a backwater. They did have a few good schools, and they're, you can all see them dressed up in suits and stuff, and they're walking around and trying to debate with them. The hope being that if I debate rationally, we will get freedom. Which of course is a really dumb idea. Rational debate does not get you freedom. And Mahatma took a different tack. He spent time with them. He said, "This is crazy. I don't know. How can I talk for India if I don't know what India is?" And he decided that he would now dress like the poorest people in India. And that's where he went, where he had this one cloth or two cloths that he would do. He slowly stripped his food out and basically ate raw food, and small meals. So he's very emaciated and bony. And if he hadn't been doing his spiritual practices, he would have. So he actually put his money where his mouth is, right? Now, obviously, this is not as easy as saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to strip down and do this." Sarojini Naidu, who's an amazing poet and was one of the first governors of a state in independent India, was one of his dear friends, and she said, "It costs a fortune to keep Mr. Gandhi in poverty." And so obviously, right, he's a Mahatma. There's thousands of people around him. There's people who want pieces of him everywhere. When he went on train rides, trains would often stop because people would jam the lines because they wanted to see him. Just see him, not even get a speech. And so, but he slowly built that power of the people. And he did this in a way that was non-manipulative. Right? I think that's one of the big important differences between someone like Gandhi and other demagogues. Demagogues, and of course the British, of course, thought he was a demagogue because he was against them. But Gandhi's whole thing was that, look, the point, and he kept insisting on non-violence, by the way. That was his big thing. He kept insisting on non-violence. Now, calling it non-violence is sort of silly and it's incomplete. It's not a bad translation, but it's an incomplete translation. It leads to a lot of people, especially at this distance, making mistakes about him, right? But for him, the point was that you had to be able to act from your heart, and your love and your sense of being was something that we all shared. That was a thing that united all of us. It was not something that was unique to me or you. It was something that all of us had. And when we acted from that place, then we were able to create transformations. So the non-violence was not about just, not being violent. The non-violence was an active offering of love. And you had to offer that love to the oppressor. You had to offer that love to the dictator. You had to offer that love to the policeman who was beating you. Because if you didn't offer that love, then you were just being a coward. Right? If the only reason you weren't violent was because you didn't have the strength to be violent, that was not non-violence. Right? So non-violence is not ahimsa, which is the actual term he used, is an offering. It's not an absence, it's an offering. Right? And similarly, the word that he used was satyagraha. Satyagraha, again, if you remember, we talked about the word sat, truth, right? But the idea of satyagraha is that I'm offering my life force. I'm offering the soul force. The soul force was, by the way, Gandhiji's term. We talk about that. We're offering that inner source, that inner force, as an offering into this world to help the transformation. Without that offering, all you're doing is disguised violence. Right? Without that offering of love, what you're doing is something other than satyagraha, something other than non-violence. And he was, by the way, very clear on that. So one of the big things he said, for example, that was the quote I was going to, was place he got famous was one of the places he got famous. He did that for many people. But there was an Indian man who came up to him, and he was from a different part of India. Now, in India, sectarianism is huge. So he was Tamil, southern India, and in those days, it would have been perfect sense for him to say, oh, I don't know who you are, you're not part of my clan, my caste, my geography, I don't care what happened to you. But he was one of the people who said, no, we're all Indians, And he'd been beaten by the white person who had him as an indentured servant. They used to call it indenture in India, and especially the Indian diaspora. Much nicer word than slavery, I guess, I'm not sure. But for some reason they thought it was different. In theory, you were able to get out of it, but of course it didn't work that way. And the Mahatma instead said, no, he took him to the police, made complaints. The magistrate got appalled when he saw the condition of this guy. They, of course, got him doctor and healing help. And then they went and got that person fined and put in jail, which was unheard of in those days, because it was usually that people could beat their slaves or their servants without any consequences. And when someone asked him about that, he said, if I found myself entirely absorbed in the service of the community, the reason behind it was my desire for self-realization. I had made the religion of service my own, as I felt that God could be realized only through service. And service for me was the service of India, because that's where I had the aptitude. And see, that's the important part. It's not as if service is generic, right? Obviously, all of us do some service. And the service has to grow from our aptitude and has to be true to the shape of our soul. And that's something he was very clear on. Even as he had millions of people following him, he was very clear that it's an individual journey, that you cannot force the shape of nonviolence, the shape of ahimsa on anyone. It has to be something that I can invite, but that you then bring your own shape to. Does that make sense? Like there's many people, like I was intrigued when you talked today about the horses. We have so many people I know who focus on dogs and cats, right? And that's a big problem in this community. But I loved it when you talked about the horses, because that's something I don't personally think about. It's not part of my mind space, but I recognize what you're talking about. And I think that the shape of your soul responds to them in a way that's different from the shape of my soul, right? And as we all come together in these shapes, that's where the beauty comes forward. And I think that's part of what he was very clear on, is that we need to get into that depth, that sense of soul that makes us work. So over time, the Mahatma became not just a grassroots movement leader, he actually became the senior political leader in India. And, Churchill, who starved 4 million Indians to death during the middle of the Second World War, great man, quote unquote, he was angry at the idea of having, Churchill was an out-and-out racist, right? I mean, there was just no redeeming factors to him there. He was just a crazy racist clown. And he was very pissed off, and he had to negotiate with the Mahatma. Like, why am I dealing with this half-naked fakir? Because the Mahatma would insist, like in cold of England, he would go, in his little loincloth and sandals and a red shawl, and, I hope that people warmed him up later on in fires, but you could see him in those old newsreels walking through, cold London streets, wearing very little. And people were totally taken aback by him doing that. But part of it was he was not playing a role anymore, right? I mean, may have started off by saying, I need to understand what's going on. But as he spent time with that shaped him authentically. And he did that journey. And as he went forward, he became very clear that he had to speak for the people of India. And that was the dance. And, like any dance where you have a revolution, your revolution is always incomplete, right? There is no perfect answer. And one of the things I think about him is like, when he made mistakes, oh boy, he made huge mistakes, right? And so there's many mistakes you can talk about him making, but it's like his mistakes were like 10% of what he did, right? As against 90% of what he did. Nowadays, just like with Martin Luther King in this country, there's a huge set of people who are trying to discredit him in India, right? They have a lot of political power, they have a lot of media power, so there's a lot of stuff about him, complaining about him and so on. And the interesting thing is that they can usually be absolutely truthful and also absolutely quoting him, because he was very transparent, he was very truthful about what he said. Of course, it's selective because, he made mistakes, huge ones, but they were a fraction of all the good he did. And so he spent time there trying to prevent the big issues we had in India at that time were independence, of course. You had the issue of Hindu-Muslim relationships. What do we do there? And you had the issue of caste, right? Caste is an invidious Indian construct, 5,000 to 7,000 years old, that in many ways cripples India even today. And so he struggled with all of those, made mistakes on caste, made mistakes on Hindu-Muslim things, made mistakes on independence, right? Made mistakes on all of these aspects, but he also moved every one of these forward a huge amount. And eventually India did get freedom. A lot of the populist jingoists were very unhappy with him because they really wished that he would have been far more aggressive as a quote-unquote Hindu. But his form of being a Hindu was the generous, loving, open aspect, not the parochial, cramped, violent, bigoted approach that is so popular in pretty much every religion around the world now, right? It's like something that most religions can go, oh yeah, I like that part. Unfortunately, those of us who don't have a responsibility to speak up and care, have a heart open to that. And eventually one of them assassinated him within a year after independence, which was fairly tragic. I think it would have been interesting to see what India would have done if he had kept pushing for the agenda, because once he left, a lot of the power and the force for the grassroots left the national political scene. It became more of a client relationship again. Like, most politicians, it became less of the voice of the people and more about, okay, what can I get away with as I talk to people? Because, not because anyone's being bad, but because you're dealing with stuff, right? And so he left, and his funeral was his memorial march was one of the most amazing long marches that people have seen. Tens of millions of people showed up to say goodbye to him, and it was obviously quite shocking and striking. If you've not seen the movie, or even if you have a while ago, the movie Gandhi by Attenborough, it's so worth a watch, right? It's pretty amazing. He did a beautiful job. One of the things for me personally around the Mahatma was I was always interested in him, right? You grew up in India, that's part of your storyline. The 2nd of October is one of the 3 national holidays we have, right? So as a kid, that's very important because that's the day you don't have to go to school. Make sure you pay attention to that date, right? And so I always thought of him as a nice guy, And so he was called a Mahatma, which means great soul, which is a title we give for our saints, by Rabindranath Tagore. I don't know how many of you know about Tagore. Tagore won the Nobel Prize. He was, I think, the first non-Westerner to win the Nobel Prize for literature, right? Little parochial in those days. So it was quite amazing that he did that. Tagore, of course, was a mystic and a poet, and his family came from a family of poets and mystics and activists, struggling with, all the changes happening in India and trying to use art to make sense of those changes. And Tagore looks like the picture of the traditional Indian ascetic. If you see him, long white hair, big white beard, striking eyes, amazing poet. And he called Gandhiji the Mahatma. And people were like, oh, okay. So everyone started calling him the Mahatma. And I was also like, well, I guess that's poetic license, He's a poet, you can call him a Mahatma. Never thought of him as saintly. I thought of him as a fantastic activist, someone who did the work, someone who, did the inner work. But there's something, I don't know how many of you experienced it, but it's called the odor of sanctity in the Catholic Church, that if you go places, you can smell something different. Right? And I noticed that at the ashram. I've had friends notice it at the ashram. But I went to India and I was going around and I went to Ramakrishna Paramahansa, who was a well-known saint. And I went to the room he used to live in. And they allow you to go in the room and you can sit and meditate there and, walk around there. And of course, most people go in there and walk out. I was lucky I found a space and I could sit there for a while. And I noticed the smell. Wow, okay, it's different. This is India. By the Ganga, this is not a place where you're getting sweet smells, right? Not but we're like, huh. And then my wife and I were in Pune, and our driver lost his way taking me to my client, and accidentally ended up in front of Anandmayi Ma's ashram. Anandmayi Ma is, again, a very famous saint of India, very widely known to be transparent to the divine, of form of the goddess in human form. And, she was actually great friends with our guru, Dinkroli Baba. They used to play together, hide and seek. And he used to go and whine to her, Ma, these people don't feed me. And she'd feed them. And she'd be like, oh, no, it's terrible. These people are terrible. How could they not feed you? Play with her like you were a child. But Pamela and I found our way through this ashram that was empty. They were having a meeting of some sort. And we ended up in this room. And we both were like, oh, this is where we need to be. And we sat down in the room and meditated for a while. And again, you could smell that smell. And I was like, wow. And obviously, this was a very clean room, very clean. And then we stepped out, and we came out, the guys had all come out, and they were all, oh, cool, hey, how are you doing? Very sweet, very hospitable. And they said, come, we'll take you to the special place. And they took us back to that room, because that's the room that she used to sleep in, And so it had that energy of her sleeping there and being in that room right there. So I went in Bombay, they had this place, and I went to his, death memorial, Mahatma Gandhi's death memorial. It was nice, impressive. Had a cool bookshop, so I got a bunch of books. But I went to this place in Bombay where he used to live. It's right on Marine Drive, this gorgeous place, old building. And I climbed up these rickety little steps. And then they have glassed out the places where he used to live in. And you can see his little bed, the little, sandals, and the spinning wheel that he had, and so on. And I walked in there, and I stood there, and suddenly I could smell that again, that scent of sanctity. And I was like, oh, wow. And I was like, boy, have I been wrong? He was not just a good guy, but he actually had achieved a level of saintliness, a level of divine clarity, a level of divine gift. I don't know what the word is, right? And that was part of what pulled people to him. That's part of how he pulled the world along into this world of work. And I think that's just very important that people know about him, is that he was not just a good guy, but he did the work. He struggled with his desires. He struggled with telling the truth. He struggled with being kind. He struggled with how to wear clothes. He worked at this, at being a better person. It wasn't something that automatically came to him, or he did the hard work. And he did the hard work in service. He did the hard work to make the world better. He did it to help strangers, right? He didn't do it just for his friends and family. He didn't do it for his own little cult. He did it to make it better for everyone. And in his view, freeing up India was an amazing gift for British and for the Westerners, because that was going to give them freedom from being oppressors, from being violent, from being wild creatures, right? Because that's so important. We tend to forget that when you do this, you brutalize your own soul. When you're oppressing others, you are destroying yourself. And for him, there was an act of kindness to free them from that destruction of themselves that he was working on. And in a sense, as we look at this time around us, that is part of our offering, that we offer this. I post a lot of things making fun of Donald, because how could you not? Right? He is such a clown. But is there part of me that can say, I'm doing this for your betterment. I'm doing this because your soul is struggling. Your ignorance is strangling you. Your folly is creating such suffering for you and yours. And we need to do this so that you can be free, that you can also be free and have care. I'm not a Gandhi, right? So my thing is definitely laced with sarcasm and so on. But I can try. And I think that trying, that offering is critical, because without that, it's not nonviolence. Without that, it's not ahimsa. That's the critical part we need to bring, is that quality of heart that says, I'm doing this for me, and I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this for freedom, for me and for you. Our freedom is one. Our freedom is not two. I cannot be free if you are not freed from this. And I have to free you from your desire to oppress as much as I have to be free from your oppression. I think that's the most beautiful thing that the Mahatma tells us. I think it's important for all of us as we go forward in our times. And, these are the interesting times that they warned us about. So
Here we are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Punya.